All right, we are recording.
All right. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first Patio Perspectives of 2024. Patio Perspectives is our monthly series focused on the most important topics on event sustainability and my interview conversations with industry leaders. You can find all the previous segments on the SFSE website and our YouTube channel.
Webinar, but what?
As well as the
I think
monthly.
I found the discrepancy. I'll send you the way I worked it out and or what I found.
Okay.
And I think they came out exactly.
As well as the monthly blogs that I write to accompany each episode. Okay, so food waste is our topic today, and food waste continues to be a problem for events, contributing to carbon emissions and landfill waste, not to mention wasted food that could be used more productively elsewhere. Even the recent COP28 summit in Dubai took on food waste as a global issue. My guest this month, Dr. Aurora Benton, has been hyper-focused on this topic for the last year. She partnered with the World Wildlife Fund and the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, working with hotels and convention centers. They have produced a case study outlining best practices and solutions to the food waste challenges in our industry. We'll dig into the study and highlight some of the best practices and ask Aurora how we scale this across the event and hospitality sectors. Dr. Aurora Benton is the founder of Astracto. Astracto is the convergence of three passions: travel, entrepreneurship, and sustainability. Her love for entrepreneurship and social impact has manifested in more than 15 years of teaching and mentoring small businesses, especially social enterprises and environmental organizations. She's a passionate advocate for justice in supply chains, supplier diversity, and buy local programs. I sat down with Aurora last week for an illuminating conversation. So let's take a listen to the conversation, and I'll be back at the end to wrap up and give away our gift from our sponsors this month. And the sponsor is actually Astracto this month, and the winner will be receiving a signed copy of the book that she is publishing and comes out later this month. So Jody, do you want to go ahead and spin and let's listen to the conversation. And we need audio. Well, good morning, and thank you for joining today. We have a dear, dear friend of Society for Sustainable Events and somebody who's doing a tremendous amount of work in the industry, our friend, Dr. Aurora Benton. Dawn, welcome to Patio's Perspectives.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get started. There's a number of topics that I think that we could talk about today, but you just completed some work and have a case study on food waste. And so I want to ask you, why the focus on food waste when it comes to sustainable events?
Sure. So I think that food, first of all, F&B is a pretty big part of an event budget. So we should be looking at any way we can be more efficient and more strategic with that, right? Food isn't just calories. It should have a strategic purpose in a meeting. And it's also one of those areas where I think we're probably more likely to kind of do a copy paste, right? Or, you know, we just select things from a menu based on what we would like and not necessarily thinking about what attendees would like. I think another reason that I really like focusing on F&B is, or food waste in particular, is a lot of the big sustainability issues that are going on in events right now, especially on the environmental side, are things that we really need to solve, but they are big problems to solve and a tough sell. So carbon emissions, fly less. That's a tough sell with events. Yes, people are doing things and we're doing hybrid, and there are certainly, of course, efforts to do more, you know, like regional and things like that. But still, when you're trying to drive events and drive attendees and drive this business, telling people not to fly is a tough sell. Supply chain issues like biodiversity and trafficking, those are extremely important things to solve, but they're hidden under opaque layers of organizations and global, movement of goods and services. Plastic, get rid of single-use plastics in the kitchen. You're going to have to fundamentally change the way kitchens operate to do that, right? Plastic wrap and everything. And of course, we're on the way. We're doing those things. We're innovating in those areas. But I feel like food and beverage, especially for an audience, event planners, as well as, the supplier side, who aren't super savvy yet on sustainability, and this is still a new topic. So let's start with something that's very doable, actually kind of simple, not easy, but simple and really doable, especially if we focus on a handful of these sort of key takeaways that have come from the case study.
Yeah, and I think we've been talking for a long time about kind of the two big issues being carbon emissions and just waste in general. And it feels like food waste fits into both those topics. And as you say, it gets very complex, but hopefully today we can talk about some simple solutions around food waste in particular that can help solve some of these bigger problems.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe at this point, could you just give us kind of the executive summary, a quick recap of what the food waste study was about and some of the learnings from it?
Yeah, so I've been doing work with World Wildlife Fund on food waste since 2018, and I've worked with hotels and convention centers, and I had a lot of various observations and theories that I was sort of developing, and then COVID hit. And so, early coming out of COVID, the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, which partners with World Wildlife Fund, they had been doing work in the grocery sector for a number of years and were ready to really kind of go after hospitality. So we worked together on what would be sort of the gist of this? And I saw it as an opportunity to sort of hone in on a few of my theories of things that I'm like, we were to do a little more of this or focus a little more on that we would probably get some traction. And so we focused on, first of all, it's West Coast because it's the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment. We were looking at hotels and venues that were located in California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. And one of the theories that I was testing, and one of the ways we did this is, first of all, it was an event focus. Because in my mind, I was like, well, we have to go where there's an opportunity to drive this with revenue. And right now, your regular hotel guest isn't really asking for this, but event planners are needing this and asking for this. So let's focus on events. Another thing that I've been really kind of pushing and really pushed a lot in this study is getting the sales and services teams involved. And so, I'll give you a great example of how that played out early in with one of the first properties we were trying to really convince to come on board. The director of sales, I had done a whole little pitch with them, and we had kind of connected with them through the PCFWC network and stuff. But you got to sell all the different people, and even though they weren't paying for it, right? WWF and PCFWC, they're paying the bill, but you still have to do a lot to sell these ideas into the properties. And so I was on the phone with one of the director of sales had emailed me and said, well, what does this have to do with my team? Why do we need to be in this training? And so I said, well, let's hop on a quick call and talk about that. And so I said, well, first of all, before we get on, can you tell me about your donation program? And he just kind of froze. He was like, okay, point made. He did not know the answer to that question, right? And so, and I think what we find, of course, is a lot of times when the CSMs or other people are asked these questions, they attach a PDF or they, forward the email to the chef or something like that. And I'd love to share in a bit, some quotes and outcomes from having those teams involved and how much that changed. The other thing that I wanted to test out, and we'll talk about this in a moment, I imagine as well, because this has been one of the more fun and popular items that's come out of this case study. And that is we really overcomplicate the issue. We're trying to solve all the problems and I feel like, just like a lot of things in life with food waste, we probably have 80% of the waste with 20% of the ingredients and menu items. So why don't we just start there? Can we just can we just fix that stuff? And then let's worry about the rest, right? But we're so busy trying to solve sort of last mile problems when we haven't even gone the first 1,000 miles in the journey, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
that's
a little bit like not seeing for the forest for the trees.
yes, exactly. Right. And so, and then that also leads to some other, those sort of low hanging fruit things that we see, vessels being one, menus being another. So, so we basically did this training across 7 properties up and down the West Coast. We did focus groups before, focus groups afterwards. They went through this whole training that I do, and it's really fun to do this work because it's fun for people to be like, oh, like, you go, you walk in the room and you flip on the lights.
Yeah.
And sometimes, of course, that means the critters scurry, but it's good to be able to see the truth of what's happening. And then once people see it, they're fully capable and excited to solve it. It just, sometimes I feel like a lot of my work is just making them see that there's a problem to solve in the first place.
Yeah, I think, to that point, I think that a lot of planners and a lot of suppliers really have never taken that kind of step back to look at what are the areas that are creating the big waste. And to your point, like many things in life, it's the 20% of the total that is really creating the most waste. So how do we actually start to attack that?
Yeah.
So in the study then, well, how does this change the conversation then between planners and suppliers? What does this do now? Now that you've done this training, how will suppliers talk to planners differently?
Yeah, this is the next frontier for me. I think that what I find, so I imagine that the planner's journey is going to be a little bit like my journey. Now, of course, I'm a consultant coming in, and even when someone else is paying the bill, I'm there to sell something. A planner is the buyer, so it is going to be a little bit different dynamic. But I will tell you what I encounter and what I know planners are encountering. And that is, you go in and you say, well, let's talk about food waste. And there's this blanket sort of mentality of like, well, we're good. We got it. We're doing all the things. Here's our compost. That's it. All the things. And it's so focused on just the one sort of so if the food waste reduction hierarchy, which I'll show that in a moment, because I think that's a key part of the story. Yeah. That shows that there's a priority for how we should be doing these things. And we tend to focus a lot on the things that are at the bottom of the priority. And those things are still important. They're a very important part of the solution, but we haven't really gone up the priority and looked especially at prevention. So one example that I really love, and I'm going to share my screen and show just a couple of slides to go with this. So the food waste reduction methodology, this is something that this looks a lot like a lot of different methodologies. It comes primarily from the Environmental Protection Agency in the US and the methodology they use. So basically there's sort of an order of importance.
Yeah.
And I think we focus, so it's just like in our healthcare, right? We focus so much on treatment and not enough on prevention.
Right.
So we really focus a lot on, when you've got a compost, check, we're done. There's a lot of like celebration around that. That's great. We don't do nearly enough recovery. That's starting to change. There's a lot of that happening in convention centers, but not so much as much in hotels. And then a lot of times, especially in hotels, what you'll get is like, oh, we're good because we sent it all to the staff cafe. Okay. And then I hear the staff going, oh God, we got to eat that again. And they don't want to eat it, like it's, and so it's just this sort of like, we're good, we're doing the thing, right? Well, one of the properties that I went into, they have a digester, right? So it's, if you don't know what that is, imagine that it's just a massive garbage disposal that turns food waste into gray water that can go through the sewage system. So it's a solution. It's not an ideal solution, but it is definitely a solution, better than landfill, right? So this one large hotel property I went into, they were like, we have a digester. I was like, oh, we got this machine. It's like, they were so excited about it. And so then I was like, well, that's great, and so then we do the training, And when I did the interview with them afterwards, this was what one of them said. He said for the last few years, the digester to them meant literally, we don't have food waste. That was what they saw the digester to mean. We don't have food waste. But now the mindset is the digester is just a piece of the solution, not the primary focus. If it's there to catch what we didn't catch in the forefront. And changing that mentality has been one of the biggest takeaways. I love that because that is the eye-opening thing that needs to happen in order, getting back to your question about what's the difference in the planner conversation. Well, it's hard for the planner to have the conversation if the supplier, if the hotel has this mentality of like, we don't need your input on this. You don't need to ask any questions because we got it all covered.
Right.
And then it's just like this, like, let's just sweep it under the rug. And there's not really an opportunity for consultation around menus and choices and, all these other things that could really prevent waste.
Well, it's so interesting that chart reminds me so much of a chart that Shauna McKinley has shared with us before on carbon emissions, where it's sort of the same idea of like kind of prevention at the top and offsets at the bottom. It's like that same mentality of like, let's work on actually preventing the problem before we get to,
right,
a minor part of the solution.
Exactly. And I will say, thank goodness for things like composting and donation and stuff, because it opens the door to the conversation. And I do think that the planners can start to ask, and this is something that I, want an opportunity to really kind of get out more and more, is helping planners ask specific questions that sort of peels back the layer a little bit to say like, well, can you provide me your compost trend data from the last 6 months?
Yeah.
Can you share with me a story from your last major donation? Can you send me a link to the donation partner that you're working with? Maybe
Right.
we'd like to, feature them in our event app or something like that. So when you start asking detailed questions, it's going to change the game. And what that's going to mean is sometimes, just like with anything else you're negotiating in an event, there are trust issues, right? They're going to say one thing and do something else. And that's no different than the other stuff you're going to deal with when you're dealing with a supplier and maybe they don't follow through on everything you've asked for. So this is just one more thing that can sort of play into that negotiation and trust that needs to be built between the planner and the hotel or venue.
Yeah. Well, let's dig into that even a little bit more. So we were talking a little bit before we started in terms of, a hotel, for example, who is pushing back on a planner around, we just can't have empty chafing dishes, for example, on a food table. So what kinds of pushback could planners get if they have aggressive goals or just want to challenge the way suppliers are responding?
Yeah. So first of all, money, right? So some venues are charging extra to do these things. And I will say, I get that from, there's a lot of sort of philosophical difference in how people think about this. I think sometimes people have this mentality of, because you're saving the earth, you should do it for free. I don't work for free. I'm out there doing this amazing stuff to save the planet, but I don't do it for free, right? And so there's a line you have to cross there sometimes. And it's like, it does take extra people. It does take extra equipment. It does take extra time to do some of these things. Now, ideally, the hotel and the venue would have this already so built into their systems, and they will have already identified the cost savings that they won't feel like they need to pass along the cost. I feel like if you're seeing the cost being passed on, it's because they're so focused on reduction that they haven't focused on prevention, which means they haven't reduced food cost. So their food costs aren't changing, their labor costs aren't changing because they're still producing too much and they're still buying too much and serving too much. But then now they still have all this waste. So somebody's going to have to pay the bill to deal with all this waste. And so I think that the price is one issue. And then I think, again, like menu is another issue. Like if you're trying to save money and you want to maybe edit a menu, they may have a very specific way they want that to be done. And I find a lot of times neither side is really thinking through how humans eat, right? So
Right.
one of the things I hear all the time is planners will remove proteins from breakfast to save money. And a lot of times what the venues will do is sort of behind the scenes, they will overcompensate and serve extra pastries. Well, I don't know about you, but if I can't get bacon, I don't eat 4 croissants to make up for it. And so I think most humans are like that, right? So just even thinking about like, how is it people eat? And gosh, if you really did the math, you probably would be better off serving that expensive protein and being more reasonable about your portions across the board. You'd probably waste less, right? So and these are time consuming conversations. These things require compromise and change, and nobody wants that. Everybody's trying to avoid that. Everybody's busy. And so it does take an acknowledgement from both sides that we're going to have to sit down. We're going to have to talk through these things. You're going to have to follow through, and you're going to have to show me that you're willing to do the things that we're talking about. And that comes from both sides. Listen, I hear a lot from the suppliers that the planners need to understand the way they are causing the problems, right? So this is not a one-sided thing. Both sides need to listen to each other so that they can identify some of the decisions they're making that are creating the excess.
So would you say then that what it really comes down to is that when you're getting pushback from either side, it really comes down to establishing a relationship, establishing communication lines, and again, as you said earlier, develop a level of trust where you can feel like that you're being honest with each other and you're trying to work towards the same goals.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we always talk about measurement being key to success in all of this. So I know for the case study you developed or had a food tracker tool that was created and used. How's it being used? Can you talk a little bit more about the food tracker tool and how it's being used?
Yeah, so first of all, just to back up a little bit on this whole idea of measurement when it comes to food waste. So this is kind of another one of those sort of observations and theories that I had been making. And as I started getting more and more into the work over the last couple of years, I'm like, wait a minute, like, how have we made data actionable for the people who need to make the decisions? So a common thing that everyone does is aggregates food waste into weight, right? Pounds. And you need that at a certain level, right? Like, especially if you're trying to compare like year over year, large scale, especially macro, like, national organizations that are tracking like hunger and supply chain food loss and all that. You have to have a common unit of measurement that you can aggregate up into. Right. But if I walked into a kitchen and I said to a pastry chef, you know what, we had 1,345 pounds of compost last week. Oh, okay, what am I supposed to do with that information? Well, okay, now there's more and more of these technology platforms in the kitchens where, okay, well, now we know it was 46 pounds of banana bread and 89 pounds of cheesecake, but still, that's definitely better. There are two challenges with that. One is I unfortunately hear too often from staff in kitchens that those systems are not being used consistently, which means you're only measuring part of the problem, which means you only have like a part of a vision. And those, it's not to say that the technology is the problem, it's culture and consistency that's the problem. So, of course, we're all working on that, trying to get, that problem fixed, because those technologies are going to be really, really powerful. But one of the things that I feel is really important is even before you have, or in conjunction with one of these technology platforms, people need to understand the problem in a very manual way. Mm-hmm. They need to see and understand the value of what they're going to get out of that technology by first kind of doing a very old school spreadsheet kind of approach to this. Yeah. And so one of the things that I have insisted on is like, we really have to break this down to the very basics. And it just makes me think, Paul, about the conversation you and I had when we were talking about the tracker. And I was saying, like, I asked chefs about and banquet captains, because this is not just a kitchen problem. That's a key part of this. This is not just a kitchen problem. So I asked all the different departments, like, well, what's the information where do you see the problem? What's the information you have? Because we're not tracking a lot of the right information if we're just looking at pounds. So we started looking at things from the perspective of vessels and servings and portions and things like that. And remembering that the time anyone has to actually sit down and put anything into a spreadsheet like this is minimal at best. And so I remember, Paul, you had the great idea. I think you were saying, like, could we add food miles to the column? And I'm like, whose job is that? It's a great idea, but whose job at the property is it to go and figure out the food miles for every item? Right now, of course, eventually, ideally, technology will bring all this together, and your procurement systems will, loop into your food tracker systems, and you'll be able to just spit that information right out. But we are a ways away from that, right? So for now, I think we just have to, let's focus on the 80-20 rule. Let's focus on the basics, and the basic problems boil down to the most commonly wasted items. It's the vessels that they're put in. It's replenishment rates. It's the way we order things at portion sizes. So it's just a lot of the same things kind of over and over. And I feel like if we can fix some of those things, then we can look at then we can add things like food miles and other, biodiversity and other kinds of things. And so part of it is trying to create a form that's very editable. And I'd love to, you want me to show the form here? Okay, I'm going to show you a version of it. Now, this is what I love. So originally, years ago, Rural Wildlife Fund had created some trackers as part of one of their first initiatives, Hotel Kitchen, that they came out with. And when we were doing this, we were like, let's not reinvent the wheel. Why don't we take that and because I was even looking at the tracker and I'm like, I don't understand what this column means. I don't understand what you're supposed to do this. This doesn't seem as user-friendly as it could be. So let's make some improvements, right? I mean, it's all about continuous improvement. And the spreadsheet was locked, so nobody could edit it. So I was like, you know what? Let's start from scratch. And so we worked with this other consulting team, Cascadia. We worked together in collaboration to create a new form. And the whole idea was, you want to add food miles? If you know how to insert a column, you can add food miles. You want to add, this food cost, you know how to insert a column, you can add food costs. Make it just, if anybody who knows how to use Excel can use it. Now, the spreadsheet, I'll send you the link so you can share it with the audience and they can download the tracker that we came up with. What I'm going to show you here is one of the venues, Vancouver Convention Center. They actually took it and morphed it into what works for them, which is like exactly what you want, right? And another big part of this was, in conjunction with the tool, was another thing that to me is a game changer. And that is to do something I call a photo audit. Because the other element of this was, there's a good chance you won't be able to weigh anything. You won't be able to weigh anything, but you have production sheets. You can count things, because you count things when they're put on, like, racks and in hot boxes and things like that. Somebody's job is to count that and match up the numbers and all that. You have all that, but you're not likely to be able to weigh things. So what can we do to make this tracker usable if weight is off the table? If you don't have a scale, if you can't actually do the weighing, plus the fact that if you're weighing things, you're usually throwing a bunch of things together, and how does that help you solve a particular problem? So I introduced this idea of a photo audit because I had started doing that years ago, almost by accident. I was taking a bunch of photos at an event, and later I was like, oh, look at that. And look at that. I started seeing all these problems that could be fixed that I didn't notice in the moment because I was just running around taking quick photos. So what you're going to see here is a combination of the tracker form and photo audits. And what they did is they did an audit of bread rolls, and they did two different audits. One was showing the bread waste on a buffet, and the other was on plated. Because it's so interesting. Again, think about how people eat. If you walk up to a buffet, you're piling everything on your plate because it all looks so good, and you're not sure what else is going to come down the line. So you're just piling it all on your plate. When you sit down, probably that piece of bread is, okay, I don't even care about that anymore. I'm going to eat the steak first, and the potatoes and the dessert and everything, right? Okay. If you're sitting down to a plated dinner, you're hungry, the only thing on the table is the bread. You're going to eat the bread. And so what they did is they did this audit where they compared bread at a buffet to bread at a plated dinner, and found that the plated consumption was much higher, and they, of course, you can see what their standard proportion is supposed to be. It's supposed to be 1.3 bread rolls per person. Turns out when they did the math, it was 1.48. Right. So one of the things that came out of this is like, we should probably lower that standard, and we should probably stick to that standard. Right here, what they ended up deciding at the end of this was like, let's just take it off the menu. We can still sell it to planners who want it. It's now going to be an enhancement. Right. So planners, you want your bread, you're going to have your bread. But by making the planner pay extra for it, it forces now this is starting to force the conversation of like, well, why are you making me pay more for bread? Well, let's show you some of our audits. I'd like to share some data with you that shows you what we find is in buffets, the bread tends to be wasteful. So why don't we spend that budget on something better? Let's have some better table decorations. Let's have another bar open. Let's do something else with that money rather than throwing it away, right?
Well, and
so
it also goes right to your chart in terms of prevention being right at the top.
Exactly. That's what this is about. And again, 80-20 rule. I told them, I'm like, just audit one item. Like one of the participants they were going to be installing one of the technology trackers in, and they were talking about how they were going to have to program in their entire menu. And I said, that's great. But if your corporate will allow you, I recommend you just start with one of your breakfast menus or one item, because your chef is already pushing back hard on using this tracker form to just audit bread. And if he's pushing back just to audit bread, you think you're going to program in an entire menu and get his whole staff? Why don't you crawl before you walk? And you're going to learn along the way. And when you do that, what's really valuable in this, okay, I'm going to show you one more. This comes from the Oregon Convention Center in Portland. And what they did is they empowered their team to make these choices and changes. And so this is one of the banquet staff saying, you know what, we realized, why do we put 10 pieces of bread on every 10 top table? We probably don't need that. Let's go to 7 and see what happens. The world didn't end. No one was hungry. It was fine. And so they continued with that practice. And that, and actually, I haven't updated the slide, but actually got numbers from them. And in the first 9 months of doing this practice, it was almost 10,000 rolls saved.
Yeah.
That's prevention, right? And now, because just bread, probably the cheapest thing that you're going to do. But now your staff believe in it. Now your staff are saying, they really are going to, this isn't just a shiny object. This isn't just another training they made us sit through. This is something that matters, and that they're listening to us, and they're actually driving change. Just on bread, it just takes 1 or 2 items to get them to really pay attention to that.
Right. Yeah, that is amazing information. It'll be interesting that, if we can get to the point where enough venues have that kind of data to be able to share with planners who are either over ordering or not really thinking through, to your point, the way people eat, and ordering things that are just going to go to waste.
Yeah. And I think that can be powerful to be able to have data like that to show to planners, even if it's to push back on the planner, like, here's why that's not a great choice. Here's why boxed lunches are not as the greatest solution you think they are. Here's why this particular buffet really works better if you add the protein. When you have the data, and even if it's not super refined data, if it's just a few data points, and those photos are really powerful when you can show photos and say, like, see, this is what happens. I mean, I'll tell you, this photo thing also became a game changer when I was going into the properties and trying, because a lot of times I get a lot of pushback from the chefs. The chefs kind of look at me like skeptical, like, who are you? You're not even a trained chef. You've never worked in a kitchen. And I'm like, I'm not here to tell you how to do your job. You are a smart person who got to where you are for a reason. I'm here to make you see something you haven't been willing to see. And when I put the photos up, and that's the other thing about the culture change, right? When you put a photo up, you can't have a chef say to someone else, because this happens sometimes. I will have them talk about what do you see that's wasteful? And one team will be like, oh my God, the cheese boards, all these cheese and charcuterie boards end up in the trash. The chef's like, no, they don't. It's like, yes, they do. Why don't you believe me? Here's a photo of them. Now you can't argue with that, right? And so the data in the photo sort of takes away a little bit of that sort of finger pointing. Now all of a sudden it's like, okay, we all see that we have a problem. What are we going to do together to solve this problem? So I think it helps also with that culture shift.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple of times things like vessels and portion size. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that? What kinds of things did you discover in the case study, especially around, vessel size and portion size and some of those kinds of things that tend to be, ubiquitous problems?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, with vessels, and I didn't mention it earlier, and I'm sure anyone who's listening who has seen some of this work already is going to be like, she didn't talk about the PPIs. So let me first talk about the PPIs. So one of the things that came out of this, again, me kind of going like, I've set this hypothesis based on this work I've been doing. So I started asking every venue and hotel, like, hey, write up a list of your most wasteful things. And I have them sort of do little, cross-functional groups, or had this department do over here, and then kind of compare their list. And then I took all those and put them all in a spreadsheet and started looking at like, well, of course, there's some common things. So I call these the prolifically problematic items. And it might be a little bit different from venue to venue, but it's pretty much across the board, these categories of foods that you see over and over again. And what's amazing is that we have to realize that because you have such a small number of ingredients that are so prolifically wasted, they become white noise. It just becomes white noise, and you don't even really think about it. And of course, you do it for reasons like you want to have fillers, right? And so my big thing is a lot of times when I train especially planners, but I train everyone now, I make everybody sing together. Volume does not equal value. Volume does not equal value. Like there's other ways to give people a valuable experience besides heaping piles of stuff no one's eating. Another one of my favorite revelations from this was I was doing training at one of the properties, and I was talking about the fruit and the prolific waste of especially of cantaloupe and honeydew. And I showed the slide, and one of the banquet captains who'd been at the property for like 30 years, he pipes up and he says, yeah, but melon is cheap. And I said, congratulations, you didn't pay much for that trash. The look on his face was priceless. And that is the embedded mentality that is driving this waste. The other thing is vessels, right? So a lot of times I talk about like the salad dressing has become the running joke over the years. Just the amount of wasted salad dressing is ridiculous. So I'll show a photo like this, and inevitably the chef in the room, happens all the time. Chef in the room will say like, well, I know how much ounces per person you're supposed to have on salad dressing. And I'm like, yes, but do your line cooks know that? Because they're the ones pouring this stuff into bowls, not you, right? And usually that's an eye opener, like, oh yeah, they probably don't know that exact. Plus, they're just filling a bowl. Somebody hands them a bowl, they fill it up. They're not measuring it based on the number of attendees. They're filling a bowl to an aesthetic level. Right. The other thing one of my favorite ones was one chef, he was like, oh, my people know better than that. That was this chef here, and this was after lunch, the amount of salad dressing left over. So again, power of photos, right? So the vessel problem tends to be a one size fits all. I mean, you could bathe a small child in this vat of maple syrup. It's just ridiculous, the things that we see when it comes to the vessels. And it's because we have a lot of times these are chosen for aesthetic reasons, right? Or for food safety or things like that. We're not choosing these things based on waste. So when we did the case study that we did at the Seattle Hyatt with the Circularity Conference back in June, and we did an audit, one of the things that came out of that was they normally serve syrup in these sort of like large sort of cast iron pots, right? And because we were there to put a microscope on these things, the morning of the breakfast, they were like, we should use smaller vessels. Ding, ding, ding. Yes. So they used smaller vessels, which automatically prevented 60% waste on the syrup. After this event, when I talked to a member of their team a couple of weeks later, they were already switching over to carafes, almost like coffee carafes. So now you have zero waste. When you need to empty those carafes out, like just to clean them and refresh them, that syrup is now used in bakery products. Now you're talking zero waste, right? It's a game changer, and it was a simple, affordable change because it's just a vessel. And most of the properties are like, oh yeah, well, we have some capital we can put on that. So the vessels ended up being a really big part. And of course, portion sizes, you know, we looked at things like, okay, here's an audit where we actually did weight, and we said, okay, well, how much butter was left over afterwards? Do we really need that much butter on every table? This is a good one, right? Cream, 140 ounces of cream was wasted. Why don't you just put one of the creamers instead of two, right? So again, portion size per table and then portion size per person. That is a massive piece of cheesecake for a luncheon. And so you can see, even without having the weight, even without a single scale involved, you can clearly see that you could change this to a bite size, you know, little bite size portions, or just maybe even a third of this size of cheesecake. So again, portions, vessels, easy things to solve.
I especially love the melon example, because I can't tell you how many events I've gone to where they have a breakfast buffet and they put out all this melon, and then they put a few little berries around the edge to kind of give it color. And those are the very first things that people eat, and all that's left is the melons. It's hysterical.
Yes, I know, exactly. And we do it, it's everywhere. And here's what I love. I've probably had 15 opportunities in the last year to present the prolifically problematic items to audiences.
Right.
And pretty much every time it generates laughter. And why is it that generates laughter? Because we all see it. We see it so, it's one of those things that we see it so much that it becomes comical, right?
So I have to say that it seems like the case study and what you're focused on is really about creating a culture of sustainability within an organization, something that we've talked about on this program before. I'm interested in what your thoughts are about that, and how do you see the culture changing for the clients you've worked with for this study?
Yes, this is where my heart beats. So one of my favorite quotes from this study, and this is something I have done since my very first food waste training almost 7 years ago, was I insist that every department be in the room and that every level of the organization is represented. That is a very, very hard thing to get venues to do. I ask for it, and some are great. I'll show up and there'll be 35 people in the room, and it's amazing. And those people who are willing to do it, they get out of it what they put into it. Other places I go, I show up and there are 5 departmental leaders and no one else in the room. I take what I can get, but it's also like, did any of you think about how you're going to now convey this back to your departments? Right. And I think what happens is they assume they don't know anything about me or my training, as much as I try to give them, you know, some advanced understanding. And so there's this sort of mentality of like, oh, training, we're going to go in and sit and listen to this person talk for 4 hours. And I'm very interactive and I'm very hands-on, and it's a very different kind of experience. And I think a lot of times afterwards, there's a little bit of a, oh, we should have invited, you know, so-and-so into this as well. Told you so. Anyway, so one of my favorite quotes was from one of these organizations that they brought in everyone, had, you know, all kinds of departments and levels involved, is the director of event operations said that afterwards he started to notice that the line level staff had this sort of a sense of belonging in how they were being part of the solutions now. He said, I saw commitment rather than compliance. Because every time we've introduced changes before, they always assume, oh, you're just trying to save money. This is just because you're trying to save money. And because they learned about food waste and they learned about how we're donating our food, and when they learn about why it's important, their mentality, their attitude going into this is totally different. Commitment rather than compliance. Who wouldn't want that? What manager would not want that as a result? I think another big part of this that really is something that tends to be overlooked And that is the role donations can play. So what happens when donations is even happening, because again, in a lot of hotels, it's not even happening, but when it is happening, there's usually 1 or 2 people in the building who know about it. It's the person who wraps the food up, the person who meets the organization on the dock to collect the food, and no one else really knows. And what I started hearing, this was something new to me this year that I had not really thought of before. I started hearing the audiences say things like especially like the sales teams or the banquet teams, like, well, can someone, what do you do? Like they wanted to understand not in super scientific detail, but they wanted to understand food safety. They wanted to understand the process. They wanted to know what they're donating. They wanted to know how much they're donating. They wanted to know these things, but they were being left out of the decisions. And so, in fact, the organization where they said commitment rather than compliance, one of the things they said is they changed their donation process so that the lower level, the line level staff are all in charge. They get to make the decisions, they get to make the call, they handle everything. Again, you give them more of like a dignity in their job when they get to be part of the good stuff and not just like cleaning up the trash, right? And so I think that using the donation not only as a community service piece, serving your community, feeding your community, not only as like a great story to tell clients, but also as a great way to engage staff.
Yeah, and I think giving those lower line people the empowerment to make decisions helps to create that culture, right? It creates
exactly.
that sustainability. Yeah. Everybody is committed to it, as opposed to it being a mandate from corporate heads or whatever whatever the entity may be.
Exactly.
So how is this going to apply to planners? Is there any thought of doing training for planners? Because a lot of this feels like it's got to be on the planner side as well.
Yes, absolutely. And that was another thing that came out of this. I had been doing all of my training specific to food waste over the years had been on the supplier side. And so the natural evolution of this was after we were done with the pilot, we started looking at, well, what does it look like if we have the planner and the supplier? What if we train both sides? What if I could kind of help negotiate some of this stuff in the middle? And we happen to have just the right place at the right time with the Green Biz Circularity Conference in Seattle last year, and Seattle Hyatt being very committed and open to this idea. So I did a virtual training for the planner. We did that over a series. We did a 3-part series. And then I did the normal training that I do for the Hyatt on site. And so now that's really opened up a door, and I'm starting to do more of that planner training, and I love it. I love being able to talk on the planner side because there's some new things I'm getting to talk about in that training, because there are things that planners can do that suppliers have nothing to do with, like collecting data on registration, like some of the just data in general, how they're managing data, menu selection, some of the things that I think that planners have an opportunity to control, audience interaction, engaging, attendees. They have better insights and control over that than really the supplier would. So I think, and of course, having them drive the supplier to change their, because I don't always get to be on both sides. It would be ideal if I could, because I was able to really drive some great changes in that situation with the Hyatt and the Circularity Conference, in sort of like, well, why don't you take this off your menu, or why don't we do this instead? And sometimes I can only involve one side at a time, but yeah, the planner training is available now, and I'm loving doing that and getting to see how that can impact as well.
So how should planners engage with you if they want to have their organization go through planning? Or go to training?
Email me. I'm there. Yeah, so I assume you can show my email address. So Aurora at Astrapto, ASTRAPTO.com. I'm happy to just get on a call and kind of understand what is the challenge, because sometimes, depending on the kind of planner you are, like maybe you're a corporate planner and there's 20 other people you can bring into the training, and that of course would add a lot of value because it's touching different kinds of events you do. But you may be a smaller planner or a third-party planner that has such variety, and maybe you can't always control your clients, right? So the dynamics are different, but the solutions are similar. And so I'd be happy to speak with anyone about kind of what they're looking to achieve and what the training looks like.
Yeah. Okay, as we're kind of winding down and coming to the end of our time, and we could probably keep talking about this stuff for
Of
hours.
course. But then I would be giving my training away.
Yeah,
Paul.
exactly. But maybe just to wrap up, you know, based on what you've been doing, whether it's the planner training, the supplier training, just give us a sense of like, what would you say are the top best practices that people could start thinking about and working on right now?
I think that those PPIs, the prolifically problematic items, because that really simplifies, you don't have to try to digest or dissect your entire menu. Just look at one ingredient at one meal at a time. Fix that and then learn from that things that you can apply to the other. So I'd say just keep it simple. We just overcomplicate sustainability so much because there's just so much to solve and do. But for someone who this isn't their normal job, it's okay to just do one thing. And if this is the thing that resonates with you, then start with this, and you'll grow from that. But like if this is the thing that seems to really resonate, then do that. So I would say asking more detailed questions. That goes for both sides, but especially for planners to ask their hotels and venues more detailed questions, because it forces more of a detailed conversation, and let them know that you want to be consulted and guided in a way that not only provides an excellent attendee experience, make sure that there's enough food for everyone, but that also prioritizes prevention of waste.
Yeah, cool. Well, I would certainly encourage everyone to read the case study, which we will provide a copy of and or put a link to during the event. And I would encourage people to reach out to Aurora and engage her around this topic, because I think we have not shown any stats today, but I think we all know intuitively that food waste is a major problem, not even just in events, but in the world in general. And given all the issues around water and drought and, you know, fossil fuels and all the other things that are associated with food waste, it's an area of events that we can really tackle collectively. So Aurora, thank you so much for doing this.
Always a pleasure.
And we look forward to talking to you again in the future. And we'll now go back to our live event. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, Jody, let's take a little spin and see who's going to win the coupon for Aurora's book. All right, Molly Crouch, absolutely fantastic. All right, you know, as you heard, we really could have talked to Aurora all day long. She's so fantastic on all of this stuff. And as I said at the end of the recording, I would encourage people to read the case study, to reach out to her. I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for 2023, which now will turn into 2024, obviously. We have some great sponsors. We obviously couldn't do some of our programs without their support. So thank you to all of our sponsors. Thank you to Aurora. Please stay tuned. Next month, we will have another topic and another guest. February 21st, Wednesday at noon Pacific. We will be announcing the topic and the speaker very, very soon. So keep an eye out in your email and on LinkedIn, and we will see you all next time. Thank you all so much for attending today. Have a fantastic day, and keep working on sustainability. Thanks so much. Bye.